There are three joints primarily involved when cycling. The hip joint experiences mainly flexion and extension, but it's also exposed to small ranges of internal and external rotation, along with abduction and adduction. The knee experiences both flexion and extension, while the ankle is exposed to both dorsiflexion and plantar flexion.
Next, we will look at what muscles are used during a pedal stroke. The anterior muscles used are your rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and your tibialis anterior. The posterior muscles are your gluteus maximus, your semimembranosus, your bicep femoris, the gastrocnemius medialis, the gastrocnemius lateralis, and the soleus.
There are two phases of cycling, the power phase and the recovery phase. In 1991, Timmer found that the power phase occurs when the pedal is at its highest position, or the 12 o'clock position on the face of a clock. Through the power phase, the hip extends from an average position of flexion of 30 degrees to 90 degrees, followed by a small amount of internal rotation and adduction. The knee extends from an average flex position of 35 degrees to 110 degrees. Once the hip and knee are both extended, the ankle plantar flexes from 15 degrees to 35 degrees. The recovery phase occurs when the pedal is in its lowest position, or 6 o'clock on a clock face. Throughout this phase, both the hip and knee return back to their original flex position, and the ankle returns to a dorsiflexed position.
Now we will take a look at the muscle contractions that take place during a pedal stroke. The pedal stroke is traditionally broken down into either the push power phase and the pull recovery phase, or by 360 degrees. Figure 4 shows the percent of activation of several key muscles at specific degrees, while Figure 5 shows the activation of each muscle by phase. Lower limb muscles are activated and deactivated in a given section of the crank cycle. For knee extensors, larger activation is observed at the top of the cycle, or 0 degrees. This early recruitment has been associated with the early knee extension required to move the pedal forward. Hip joint extensors have later activation, closer to 90 degrees of the cycle, in order to accelerate the crank and drive large forces through the pedals. Next, we will examine the position, velocity, and acceleration of cycling. It is important to note that the evaluation of biomechanics of cycling is limited to mostly the sagittal plane because of the large range of motion of the hip. The lower body is the main focus in motion analysis of cyclists due to the large contribution of the lower limb muscles. The forces involved in pedaling action largely fluctuate throughout the crank cycle. This is because muscle force production depends on the muscle length and consequently joint angles. In order to create the best joint angle, a rider may raise or lower the seat in order to give themselves the best mechanical advantage possible. In creating that mechanical advantage, the rider is able to output more power and therefore achieve a higher velocity and acceleration.
The position of seat height on a bicycle can influence length-tension relationships of muscles and can place a greater workload on the knee joint. Foot position on a pedal can also allow for a greater mechanical advantage as well. The more anterior the foot lies on a pedal, the more horizontal force is produced. Larger wheel size and longer pedal cranks can lead to increased pedaling force, but also lead to quicker rates of fatigue.
Newton's first law is commonly referred to as the law of inertia. The bicycle prior to the rider beginning to pedal is in a state of inertia and wants to remain still. Once the individual riding the bike begins to pedal, the bike is then put into motion. In theory, from this force, the pedaling, the bicycle could possibly never stop moving. Objects in rest stay at rest, and objects in motion stay in motion, unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. What prevents this scenario from occurring is friction between the bicycle tires and the ground, friction between the axles and wheels, and air friction, or any other force that can act against the rider and bicycle. When discussing what keeps the bicycle in motion, Newton's second law comes into play. Newton's law as force is equal to the mass of an object times its acceleration. In the video pictured, force is characterized by the rider pedaling. The more force applied, the faster the bicycle accelerates. Also discussed, the more mass you have, such as adding boxes to the rider's load, the more force the rider would need to apply. The more force applied, the faster the rider accelerates. Force is translated through tension, then applied in order to apply torque on the wheel that accelerates the rider in a lateral direction. Now that we understand what causes the bicycle to be in motion, Newton's third law comes into play. Newton's third law: for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Friction occurs between the tires and the ground when a rider is pedaling. Each time the tire rotates clockwise, it's pushing the tire backwards. Simultaneously, the ground pushes the force forward onto each part of the tire, thus accelerating the rider forward. Without this third law, the amount of force and effort applied to pedaling the bicycle wouldn't matter. The bike would not go anywhere. Newton's laws are essential to cycling. It is a relevant component at each part of the process, from inertia to motion to staying in motion and stopping. Cyclists use this knowledge of Newton's laws in order to improve technique and performance. Understanding how mass and force affect the motion of cycling will directly affect a cycler's performance.